For the Prism on the Voice of Russia, I'm Andrew Hiller. Even before the onset of World War II, Europe began preparations to protect its cultural and artistic treasures. Buildings were girded, and paintings, sculptures, and ceramics were secreted away to secure locations, sometimes deep underground. Despite these precautions, thousands of pieces of art were stolen by Hitler in Germany, and though much has been recovered, some is still missing. One recent search ended in success when in February, Yuri Kuchar's 5-year treasure hunt finally ended when he found a long-lost collection of art formerly owned by Adolf Hitler. Robert Edsel is the author of Rescuing Da Vinci and The Monuments Men, Allied Heroes, Nazi Thieves, and the Greatest Treasure Hunt in History, about art treasures preserved during and after World War II, and the heroes who saved them. Edsel is founder and president of the Monument Men's Foundation for the Preservation of Art, which received the 2007 National Humanities Medal. And welcome, Robert.
How are you?
Doing well. So I think the first thing I want to know is, how did someone go from being a nationally ranked tennis player on the courts wind up in the world of intrigue and art theft?
I lived in Florence for 5 years and wondered how all these great works of art that were in these very devastated cities of Europe, in particular Eastern Europe, survived the war, and who were the people that saved them. And it led me on this quest that's been going on now for the better part of 15 years.
You mention in your book that many of the art institutions went through great efforts in order to try to preserve and protect some of these buildings and the artwork itself. Can you tell me some of the lengths that the Hermitage and the Louvre and the Gallery of London went through?
Well, works of art were packed up at the Louvre, as an example. More than 400,000 works of art moved out of the Louvre in a matter of a few weeks to area chateaux and countryside villas to provide safekeeping for them. Some works of art in the months that followed were moved around in multiple locations, including the Mona Lisa, moved on 5 separate occasions until it was returned to Paris in 1945. In 1941, with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, half their works of art, about 1.1 million works of art, were crated up and loaded onto trains and taken to Siberia before the city was encircled and the beginning of the blockade. And the other works couldn't have been evacuated in time, so museum curators there at the Hermitage lived with the works of art and suffered through the horrific conditions in Petersburg during the siege. More than 40 curators there died. The gruesome deaths of starvation that so many people in the city lost their lives to. Even in the United States, in the weeks following the prize attack on Pearl Harbor, evacuated 70-some-odd of their masterpieces to the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina. So this was the setting throughout Europe, and even in the United States. It was a horrifying scene.
And despite all of these preparations, millions of works were still stolen. Yet this wasn't the ordinary looting that you see in wars throughout human history. This was a pretty concerted effort. How organized was the effort to steal these artworks in Nazi Germany?
It was the most premeditated theft and perhaps the greatest theft in history. I mean, you have to consider Napoleon could have only dreamed of having methods of transportation like what was available to the Nazis. And of course, not only was Adolf Hitler building his collection, but Hermann Goering, the number 2 man in the Nazi Party, was in charge of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, and the train system. So having those 2 modes of transportation at his disposal, the ability to move enormous quantities of stolen objects, not just paintings, but church bells, library books, entire libraries, tapestries, stained glass. It was really boggled the mind. We're into the millions of objects, not hundreds of thousands, but millions when you consider all the different things that were stolen, some of immense cultural value, other things personal belongings from people. You know, the war went on for 7 years, and that's a long time to commit a robbery.
And yet for all the millions and hundreds of thousands of personal objects and art treasures that were stolen, there are some surprising exceptions, work they called degenerate. And these come with works like from Van Gogh and Kandinsky and Chagall, Where did some of those wind up? Were some of those somehow saved because Hitler didn't like them?
It's an interesting point you make. It is true, one of the paradoxes of the Nazi theft is that some of the things that were stolen survived the war, and they might not have otherwise had they not been placed in some of the salt mines and castles where these monuments officers ultimately found them. But that's certainly not to compliment or reward the Nazis for that unusual consequence. One of the countries that suffered the most was Germany as a result of the removal of some 16,000 modern works of art by artists that were considered degenerate. These are artists that painted more abstract paintings or brightly colored paintings, things that Hitler, in his view as a artist and architect, felt didn't reflect nature as it actually appeared. And so these works were removed from Germany's own museums. Some were sold, not terribly successfully. Some were traded, and many of them were destroyed.
Now, after the war ended, what happened to the art?
Well, the policy of the Western Allies differed greatly from that of the Soviet Union. The Western Allies declared that objects that were found would be returned to the countries from which they were stolen. That was the policy of the Western Allies enunciated by General Eisenhower, that no one should profit from this theft. And so collecting points, central collecting points, were set up in Germany. There were 3 primary points, the most important one being in Munich, where these works of art were evacuated as they were found in thousands of hiding places by the monuments officers and taken to the collecting point where they were processed, then grouped by country of origin where they'd been taken from, and then liaised with officials in those countries to return the objects. And it was then the responsibility of the host government that received these things to determine who within their country it belonged to, whether it came from a church, a museum, an individual. And that was a process that continues to this day.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the detective work of the treasure hunters?
Well, the monuments men were the ones that set the gold standard for how to protect cultural treasures during war. I mean, it was their work that, on the fly largely, that involved trying to use their knowledge of what should be in these museums and churches that was missing. So these guys were in their mid-40s, and they were all art historians, well-educated in the history of art in Europe, and they knew what should be there, and it was gone. And so that set them off on this treasure hunt, trying to gather clues, interrogate different people, try and put things together to figure out where these things had been taken to. I write about in Monuments Men a number of the, in some cases, humorous tips that they received that ultimately did lead to discoveries of thousands of paintings at the Castle of Neuschwanstein in southern Bavaria, a great collection of art, some of which was destined for Hitler's Fuhrer Museum at the salt mine in Altausee in Austria, and others. It was painstaking work. It was very frustrating. It was dangerous. There were 2 monuments officers killed during combat trying to protect works of art that had been discovered that they were trying to move out of the way. So it was a really novel concept and incredibly successfully executed by these monuments officers, to the point that at the end of the war they had found and ultimately, over a period of 6 years, returned more than 5 million objects, including some 3 million library books, thousands of church bells that have been taken from churches throughout Europe, more than 1,000 Torah scrolls, and the list goes on and on. Regrettably, the discovery of these paintings that are attributed to Hitler's collection recently, I take exception to. There's a lot of confusion about the distinction between works of art that may have been purchased under Hitler's aegis for an embassy or for an office building somewhere that had propaganda value versus works of art that were purchased by him for his collection either at Linz or one of his homes. Frustrating sometimes when we see these announcements made and the distinction between the two isn't clarified.
So you're saying that some of what we classify or we hear in the popular media as stolen art or recovered Nazi art were actually things that had been legitimately purchased?
Well, there were certainly hundreds of works of art that Hitler legitimately purchased. He'd been buying works of art for years. but there were works of art that were acquired using all possible means: coercion, theft, changing the laws in these countries to make the taking of things legal. I mean, there were really an infinite number of descriptions here. The point I'm making is the fact that announcements such as this announcement that came out of Czechoslovakia last week concerning the discovery of paintings that were purportedly in Hitler's collection just because he'd authorized their purchase is a complete mischaracterization, and I think reflects a lack of understanding of what he was trying to do. Works of art were assembled at the Haus der Kunst in Munich, the House of German Art, for annual exhibits of works that were by German painters. Some of them were propagandist in nature, and these works that were propaganda pieces were things Hitler wouldn't have bought for his own personal collecting taste ever. I mean, they just wouldn't have appealed to him. He had very well-defined interest in things, and these works that were discovered, I don't believe, ever went to the Munich collecting point. The American soldiers were not in this part of Bohemia or Czech Republic. It was in Soviet Red Army occupied territory. There may have been exceptions, but for the most part they weren't there. And these works, you know, they just don't rise to the nature of the kind of works that were ever designated to end up in Hitler's Führer Museum, which was a museum he was intending on building in Linz, or any of the different places that he had works of art that were hanging that he had selected for himself.
And today, almost 70 years later, or more than 70 years later, how much is still missing, and is there a holy grail of art objects that the hunters would really like to discover and reclaim?
In my opinion, there are hundreds of thousands of objects missing, whether it's paintings, musical manuscripts, musical instruments, tapestries, sculpture. It's a long, long list. At one point in time, the Polish government had some 70,000 specific works of art listed in their state database. These things have differing values. We in the public get hung up sometime on what these commercial values are, but if it's something that a great-grandfather passed down to his son, who intended for it to go to his son and ultimately make it to the great-grandson, it has inestimable value. That said, everybody would love to believe that the amber panels have survived. I personally don't. I think they were destroyed probably at a battle in Königsberg. I think there may be some additional of the small mosaics of the amber panels out there, and they probably will surface over the course of time. The most valuable painting that's missing is probably Raphael's Portrait of a Gentleman that was last seen in the possession of Nazi General Hans Frank in Krakow, Poland. And I believe that's out there somewhere. So, we're at a point in time now that the focus is to try and raise visibility, and one of the things the Monuments Men Foundation does is assist people that may have a work of art that they think might have been stolen or may be looking for a work of art. It's a not-for-profit entity, 501c3 in the United States we call it, and it's there. It doesn't charge money for its services, just trying to do what it can do to illuminate the path home for these things and continue the work of the Monuments Men. Any of your listeners that want to learn more about that can Google the foundation at monumentsmenfoundation.org. We regularly receive calls or emails and have been involved in some important discoveries. Most recently, some of these albums of photographs of the works of art that Hitler carried around and used to make selections of works of art that were going to go into his collection. And I can tell you from having seen them, these most recent discoveries of works of art in Czechoslovakia were not among those objects.
Now, I want to say that I agree with you. While some of these works that we're talking about clearly would be priced at auction houses at millions, I know that I have in my possession a photograph of my grandmother and my mother in 1940 when they escaped to Russia, which is priceless to me, although probably to anyone else doesn't have much value whatsoever. So yes, the small objects may be of equal or greater value to the individual families, to these wonderful works that capture our imagination when we hear about Raphael and some of the great artists of all time. You mentioned leather-bound books of photographs. What was going through your head? What kind of emotions went through you when you got to hold and discover and find this thing, which might lead to other things?
Well, we've actually found three. Two were albums ERR, Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg was one of the primary Nazi defendants at Nuremberg and was hung along with many of the other defendants for war crimes. His were extensive, but in particular pertaining to the theft and destruction of cultural property. And during the trial, one of the primary prosecution exhibit were a group of albums, 39 of these ERR albums that were brown leather-bound albums that had photographs of works of art that had been stolen primarily from collectors in France, Paris in particular, some of the most important paintings in the world that had been inventoried, photographed, and denoting the families that they'd been taken from. In fact, even more pernicious, the object number taken from the various family. For instance, R100 would be the 100th item taken from the Rothschild family, and so on. So everybody had their own identification number, and then these albums were presented to Hitler for him to flip through, both for his viewing pleasure as well as to make selections of works of art that might go to his personal collection or might be designated for some regional museum that he was looking to enhance. The two albums that we had were taken by an American soldier from his home in Berchtesgaden in the closing week of the war as souvenirs. He had no idea of their value, just picked them up, lugged them back to the United States, and ultimately he died. His nephew had them and contacted us, brought it in, and I knew what they were, but we were confused because the National Archives in the United States, where these 39 albums went after the trial, were thought to be the only 39 such albums, and we later discovered, in fact, there were probably about 100 of these albums, and so that would leave around 60 missing, and we found those two, and the hunt continues for others. A year and a half ago, found a third album of a different series. It was the albums pertaining to Hitler's actual selected works of art for Linz, so in some sense it had a different value, a more direct value, and that was a green leather-bound album that another American serviceman had taken, a completely different fellow, from the home in Berchtesgaden, from the Berghof. There were a total of 31 of those albums made. There are now 11 missing, and that was a significant discovery because most historians believed all 12 had been destroyed in a battle with the Red Army. So the search goes on there, and you're correct. Those albums provide the opportunity for us to identify still missing works of art and know the owners and get them back. And so that's an important part of what we're doing, and it's been a great honor of ours to not only represent these monuments officers, but also help complete the mission that they started some 70 years ago.
Looking through the prism for Voice of Russia at Lost and Recovered Art with Robert Edsel, director of the Monuments Men Foundation, I'm Andrew Hiller.